Hello, everybody. Welcome to the week 4 lecture and PowerPoint. um, we have been taking giant topics and squeezing them into 1 week, and I got to this part of the course, which is really easily the most important part to me, just the building blocks of literacy instruction, and that's just impossible to squeeze into 1 week. So we're gonna try 2. So this is week 1 of our building blocks of literacy module, if you want to think about it like that. All right, here I go. Try to keep it to 20 minutes. Okay. Pop quiz, not really, but I do want you to play along at home. Okay. How many separate sounds are in the word responsibility? Responsibility. Think about it. I'll give you a second here, or just hit pause on the video. I want you to write down how many individual sounds you think are in the word responsibility. All right, the answer is 14. And the way that you can figure this out is by doing phoneme segmentation. R, S, P, A, N, S, I, B, I, L, I, T. Responsibility. Fun stuff, right? If you look at the word and you look at the correct answer, you're going to notice that it's basically the same number of letters in the word. You're about to find out, if you didn't already know, that this is rarely the case in English. English is an evil language. Let's try a different one. How many sounds are in the word enough? E, N, F. That's 4 separate sounds. But look how many letters there are. Let's try another one. Stretch. S, T, R, E, Ch. All right, so I challenge you to play this game with yourself and the people around you this week so that you can practice your phonemic awareness skills and segmentation. Here's a fun one. If I clap once when I say the word dog, and I clap twice for beaver, how many times should I clap for octopus? I sound like a robot that's been trained to speak English. Octopus. 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 Right? And what are those divisions within words called? Syllables, right? Okay, here we go. Phonological awareness, a lot of literacy people will shorten it to PA. It gets confusing because there's also something called phonemic awareness. And so when they say PA, sometimes they mean one or the other, sometimes they just mean the whole thing. But what is phonological awareness? It's simply the awareness that language is made up of sounds. It's awareness that if I hear someone speaking at an airport and it's not English, I still know that the sounds that that person is making are bits of language that add up to mean something. So a typically developing child will show signs of phonological awareness quite early in their lives. Here are some signs of growing phonological awareness. Using one's voice to communicate ideas, even if it's not effective yet. It's just the attempt to use one's voice to get another's attention and to try to send a message. Attending to others' oral language, aka listening, right? Seeking meaning in the speech sounds of another person. Hearing or generating rhyming sounds in words. This is why nursery rhymes are so prevalent in early child education. The ability to identify word boundaries or count words, and the ability to hear, count, or clap syllables. Um, your assignment this week, you have two things, two voice threads, and this is admittedly an experiment. This is my first time using a voice thread in a class, but I got talked into it by our instructional technologist, and so I'm excited to try this. I think the way it works is you'll create a thread, a voice thread, and you can decide if you take a video right then and there with your webcam, or you can upload a video that you've recorded, or you can just record audio. But for one of the voice threads, I want you to model um, a classroom activity or a circle time activity where you can teach phonological or phonemic awareness to the children. So this list right here could even give you some ideas. So start thinking now about what you could do to teach phonological awareness in an early childhood setting. Okay, so if phonological awareness is just the awareness that there are bits of meaning in our speech, phonemic awareness is a little more focused. It's part of phonological awareness, but it's like the next step, and it focuses on within word sound identification and manipulation. So if I give you three phonemes, sh, e, and then I ask you to smush them together or blend them together, sheep, that's called phoneme blending. Then we have the opposite, segmentation. If I give you a word pig and ask you to separate it into its smallest sounds, you should be able to go p, I, g. Hearing the first sound in a word and saying it back, right? So if I say sheep, now everybody tell me the first sound, I should hear them say sh. These are all, again, real simple activities that you can do for your voice thread. I am not looking for a literacy center or a full lesson plan. I am just looking for, imagine in a classroom setting, we just zip around the room really quickly and you just kind of talk through something you could do in about a minute. So don't stress about this. It's a low stakes assignment. Don't overthink it. Mostly, I'm just going to appreciate you helping me learn how to do voice thread. So thanks in advance. And the last sound in a word, pig. What's the last sound? G. And then the next level is adding sounds, taking out sounds, substituting sounds, right? So if we have pig and I tell you to change the I to an E, what do we have now? Peg. Now, this is one of those things that I can't go too deep. We just don't have time. It's not really the nature of the class. But I do want you to understand that because English is such a confusing language, with how we sound things out and all of our different inherited spellings from different languages, we in literacy ed, a lot of times we'll use the International Phonetic Alphabet, which is this whole set of symbols. And I'm not going to make you learn that, but I do want you to check that out on Blackboard just so you can see what some of the symbols look like. Some of them are letters from English, but some of them aren't. So it's kind of interesting. But just for purposes of us talking about this stuff, if you see something in the forward slashes, like on the screen right now, that is a phoneme. So all three of those words contain the phoneme k, but each one's spelled differently. So, this is why English is so tough. So the other thing that's kind of interesting about articulatory phonetics is learning about the different types of speech sounds and which part of your mouth makes them. And if you have any interest in ever becoming a speech language pathologist, that's what this is all about. But the only thing I want to mention about it is that typically the sequential phonics programs that you'll see, a lot of those are sequenced based on some of the simpler articulation points. and then moving to more complex from there. So that's why a lot of phonics programs will start with b, d, p, m, n, some of the um, simpler sounds that children can make with their mouths if they are developing typically. Okay, I'm gonna zip through some important terms. If you ever hear about onset and rhyme, strangely enough, it is not exactly spelled the same as nursery rhyme rhymes. Onset and rhyme divides a word into its first sound and then all the remaining sounds. So for cat, k is the onset and at is the rhyme. Obviously, that rhyme is related to the rhyme with the H and the Y in it. It's just a weird little blip from reading instruction back in the day. If you're curious about it, just email me. Okay, grapheme. It's the smallest unit of a writing system. So for English, we have an alphabet system, so it's the letter. But you can have th, for example, could be considered a grapheme because it represents the phoneme, right? So sometimes it's more than one letter. Okay, if you ever hear people talk about minimal pairs, it's two words with only one phonemic difference. And so this matches up really well with teaching phonemic awareness and sound substitution. So again, take a minimal pair for your voice thread and transform one into the other and make a little game out of it. Okay. So we've talked about phonological awareness, the awareness that that speech sounds contain language information, phonemic awareness, understanding that words are made up of smaller sounds, and then phonics is taking our spoken language system and our written language system and sort of mapping them onto each other. It's the relationship between phonemes, the units of sound, and graphemes, the units of writing. And different languages have it better than others. You have some languages, Spanish and Italian come to mind, where for the most part, if you see a letter in a word, you know how to pronounce it. There are not too many exceptions. That's called a shallow orthography. Orthography is like the written system. So if you learn phonics rules in a shallow orthography, you're good to go. But what if your language has a deep orthography? Then phonics only gets you part of the way there. And that's why we have lots of debates about reading instruction in the United States. We'll scratch the surface of that in this lecture, not much more than that. And again, the English language uses the alphabetic principle that letters and letter combinations represent the speech sounds of our language. Here are some silly examples of the deep orthography of English, and it has everything to do with the history of our language and all the borrowed words, vocabulary, and spellings we get from French, German, Arabic even, you name it. So look at all these words that you would think would all just kind of go in a group, right? But then you go to pronounce them: taught, though, thought, through, throughout, thorough, tough. Again, English is pure evil. And if you have any sort of reading disability, you're at such a disadvantage. I'll just let you read this for a second. I won't even try to speak it. If you take all those graphemes, those non-standard graphemes, and try to spell potato, that's what it would look like. Don't take this for granted when you're working with children. What they're doing is amazing, becoming literate individuals using this tricky language. Okay, so I'm going to give you a lot of my advice which is research based on best practices for teaching phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and phonics. Because this is stuff I've just seen over the years. When you're first teaching a phoneme, don't stutter the sound. I've noticed that my EDU 280 students in the past have done this. So let's say they're doing an activity and they're introducing the phoneme B, and they'll say B, 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 big. And then guess what the children do back? B, 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 big. It's I think this comes from an old school rote learning where there is a lot of heavy repetition, but you're actually modeling incorrect decoding. We want smooth and swift blending. B, big. Go for the onset and rhyme and don't over repeat the phoneme. The other thing is adding a vowel accidentally after the initial sound. So if you're working with the phoneme P, it might not even pick up on the microphone in this video. It's very breathy, but I hear people sometimes, if they're introducing P, they say pa, pa, pig. But the problem is pig isn't pronounced pig, right? So you can't, you have to lop off. It's a definite, it takes some practice, but when you're teaching those consonant phonemes, b, g, p, t, it's tricky. It gets tricky, but just keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. I'll be listening for this when you do your voice thread. The other thing that I think is really important, and it's a common misconception, in these early childhood classrooms, you don't have to wait for the alphabet to teach phonemic awareness, phonological awareness. In fact, for that voice thread, for the first voice thread, you are forbidden from showing me any letters or talking about any letters. Speech first, then print, okay? Now, what you can do is use little props or your hands and fingers. I've seen people use little different colored blocks to represent phonemes and phoneme substitution. Those are all fine. But you don't even need that. You just need yourself and your voice to teach these concepts. Okay, the alphabet. I have an article posted on Blackboard about no, it's not on Blackboard. It's in one of the textbook readings about the alphabet myth. I could talk about just the alphabet myth for 20 minutes. I won't. The bottom line is, for a long time, people thought that the key to literacy was learning the alphabet song. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, that one, right? But what are you learning? When you teach the alphabet like that, when you teach letter names, you're teaching children the squiggly line and its proper name. In most cases in the alphabet, the name of the letter is not the phoneme that goes along with it. For example, most of the time, there are some exceptions, but most of the time, if you see the letter C in a word, it makes the sound K. But if you point at a C and ask a child, what is this? That's a C. How are they pronouncing it? C, like the 7 C's, or see the person across the lake, right? It's a completely different sound. And so what's the best solution here? Teach both at the same time. This is the letter C. C says K. And yes, I know that C sometimes says like in celery, but when we teach phonics, we go for the highest frequency version. So it's like playing the odds in Vegas. You want to teach the rule that is right most of the time, and then you can come back around later and talk about the exceptions. I posted an example of a scope and sequence for phonics instruction. There's a definite logic to it, like I was saying before, teaching high frequency sounds and rules first, teaching words in groups, right? So you could take, if you're doing the silent E phonics rule, you could teach a group of words that all exhibit that rule and do things with those words that week. That is one strategy. Okay. Um, I'll talk more about this in a couple slides from now, but even though it does seem like it kind of makes sense, I really want to encourage you to avoid encouraging children to guess what a word is by the first letter or the first sound. Because if that child has a problem with decoding, you are teaching them how to bypass skill development for decoding. So we really want children to sound a word out from the beginning to the end and then blend it and then return to what they're reading. Also, when you're teaching phonics, you'll see this term CD words, just simple consonant, short vowel consonant words that are decodable and do not exhibit weird quirks of the English language. Again, after you've decoded a word and sounded it out, encourage the child to say it swiftly, fluently. So, cat, cat. And one way to do that is if you've got the words in front of you, if we're working with the alphabet, working with phonics, you can take your finger and strike it across the bottom of the word at the speed you want the child to say it. Okay. I've mentioned this already, using hands and props. Just you can use those instead of letters to support segmentation and blending if they're not quite there with letter identification yet. Okay, the reading wars. It's a whole other thing that I don't have time to get into, but I was actually pretty happy with what our textbook has on the different reading methods. It's page 430 to 433. Chapter 15, section 15.4 on reading methods. I tell you, when you go through a PhD program in literacy, you definitely are going to be influenced by the people at your university and which way they kind of lean. I was really lucky because I had whole language people and phonics people in my program. And so I was given both sides of the story here with regard to the reading instruction debate. And the one thing I'm going to say, because our textbook is pretty balanced as well, and I'm not going to try to make you pick a side, but I will say this, because I cannot stop myself from saying this. We know that some percentage of children, some estimates I've seen are 15%, require explicit, structured, sequential, systematic phonics instruction. They cannot become readers without it. So, if you choose a reading method that does not contain some level of phonics instruction, you're directly harming those students. I don't know a nice way to say it. That is not me telling you that you have to exclusively have a sequential phonics program for your reading program. I'm not saying that. I think the answer is somewhere in the middle with all that. But I do think it is a very bad decision to not have um, any phonics in your classroom. So I hope that if you take nothing else away from this lecture, that you take that away. Again, even though a lot of us, we're all different ages in this class, but I was in grade school in the 80s and I came through during a whole language. It was very trendy. And so we did lots of guessing words from the context clue and guessing words from the first sound and the first letter. If you are a natural reader, typically developing, you'll get through that, and that's actually not a horrible skill to have later in life. But if you have dyslexia or a similar reading disability, there's a great point in your development where phonics instruction can get you caught back up and get you back on track. And if you spend those key critical years doing word guessing and context clues, you're doing some serious, almost irreversible damage. Okay, I've said my piece. Dyslexia, like I was just saying, dyslexia is what happens when phonics is a, how do I want to say this? Dyslexia is a breakdown in the process of decoding a word. And we've learned a lot more about dyslexia in the last, 20 years because we have the ability to do things like fMRIs, brain scans. Um, it is absolutely an inherited disability. You are much more likely to get it if a parent has it. It is a neurological issue. It is a brain issue, and specifically, it is a phonological issue, meaning the meeting place between speech sounds and written language. So, and I like this phrasing a lot. This is straight out of, I'll have to, I can find my source, but yes. um, Characterized by difficulties with recognizing and decoding words, and this is important, at a speed necessary for fluent reading. Next week, we'll talk about fluency for our building blocks part 2. This poor reading performance is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and quality of instruction. So remember, that's from last week. Just because someone has dyslexia does not mean that they are unintelligent. Oftentimes, individuals with dyslexia have a higher than average IQ and can present themselves as highly intelligent individuals, especially if they get to talk and listen as opposed to read and write. Dyslexia technically is not a visual disorder, even though for the person experiencing it, it may feel like the letters are swimming around. That is more of a psychological kind of panic response. But classic dyslexia has to do with hearing speech sounds and mapping them onto the graphemes. I've heard a lot of people say, oh, I switch my B's and my D's, or my P's and my Q's, so I must be dyslexic. Um, those kinds of letter reversals are incredibly common early in literacy development and not really a marker for dyslexia. Now, later in development, if that stuff is happening, then sure. But don't freak out if you've got somebody in your early childhood classroom who keeps switching their B's and D's. They're just getting it figured out. That is actually a good developmental sign. Um, so anyway, knowing what we know about dyslexia, again, it just makes a good case for including at least some explicit phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and phonics instruction into your classroom because we think that around 15% of children are not able to just organically, naturally become a reader if you put a book in front of them. And so it's a disservice to those individuals to not have that kind of instruction.